Nazis never discovered that one prisoner planned his escape from Auschwitz to tell the truth. Witold Pilecki, September 19, 1940, 2 a.m., occupied Warsaw, Poland. Witold Pilecki walked deliberately toward the deadliest trap ever built. While other Poles fled desperately from Nazi roundups, this 39-year-old cavalry officer headed straight into one, with forged identity papers in his pocket and a suicidal plan in his mind: to be captured, deported to Auschwitz, and return alive to tell the world what was really happening there. The Nazis had turned Auschwitz into an information black hole. People went in and vanished. Families received ashes with no explanation. Rumors spread about a concentration camp in the former Polish barracks near Auschwitz, but no one knew what went on inside. The Reich had created the perfect secret, a place so horrific that witnesses could not survive to testify. Witold Pilecki was going to break that secret, not by escaping Auschwitz, but by entering it voluntarily, surviving the impossible, building a resistance network inside hell, and then escaping to deliver the first detailed report about industrialized genocide to the Allies. What the Nazis never discovered was that prisoner number 4859, who looked like an ordinary Polish carpenter arrested in a routine roundup, was in fact a military intelligence agent running the most audacious infiltration mission of the Second World War. During 947 days inside Auschwitz, Pilecki built an underground organization of nearly 1,000 members, meticulously documented Nazi atrocities, established lines of communication with the outside world, and planned his escape with military precision. On April 27, 1943, after 2.5 years in a camp where the average life expectancy was 3 months, Pilecki escaped. He ran 100 kilometers through occupied territory, evaded SS patrols, reached Warsaw, and wrote a 100-page report that would become the first complete account of Auschwitz received by the Allies. The British and Americans did not believe him. They dismissed his descriptions of gas chambers and industrial crematoria as propaganda exaggerations. They rejected his pleas to bomb the railway lines leading to Auschwitz. They filed his report as unreliable. 1,100,000 people would die in Auschwitz before its liberation in January 1945. This is the story of how one man chose to become a prisoner in the worst place ever created, how he survived by documenting a horror everyone denied, how he escaped the inescapable, and how his testimony was ignored by the very people demanding proof of the Holocaust. The man before hell. Witold Pilecki was born on May 13, 1901, in Oleniec, Karelia, Russia, where his Polish family lived in forced exile under Tsarist occupation. His childhood was shaped by resistance. His family ran clandestine Polish schools, forbidden by the Russians who tried to erase Polish identity. Before he was 10, Pilecki already understood that preserving identity under occupation required organized disobedience. In 1918, when Poland regained independence after 123 years of non-existence, Pilecki was 17 and immediately enlisted in the newly formed Polish army. He fought in the Polish-Soviet War of 1919 to 1921, when Poland defended its reborn independence against Bolshevik Russia. At 19, Pilecki had already killed men in combat and understood that Poland's freedom would always be threatened from both East and West. In the years of peace between 1921 and 1939, Pilecki became something unusual: a soldier scholar. He studied agriculture, managed a small family estate in Skurcze, married Maria Ostrowska in 1931, and had 2 children, Andrzej and Zofia. He lived like a typical Polish rural landowner, except he never left the reserve army. and maintained constant military training. On September 1st, 1939, when the Wehrmacht invaded Poland from the west and the Red Army from the east 17 days later, Pilecki fought as a cavalry officer. Poland, trapped between two totalitarian powers, collapsed in 5 weeks. But Pilecki, like thousands of Polish officers, refused to surrender. When the Polish government fled into exile, Pilecki stayed behind, founding one of the first resistance organizations, Tajna Armia Polska, the secret Polish army. By 1940, occupied Warsaw was a city under calculated terror. The Nazis implemented a decapitation policy. They systematically arrested the Polish intelligentsia, military officers, professors, doctors, lawyers, priests, anyone capable of organizing resistance. Roundups were constant, unpredictable, lethal. In this context, Pilecki received orders from his resistance commander, Major Jan Wodarkiewicz. "We need intelligence on Auschwitz. The Germans are building something there. We need to know what it is." Auschwitz had opened in June 1940 as a concentration camp for Polish political prisoners. The Nazis turned former Polish army barracks into a massive prison. The first transports were political activists, captured resistance members, intellectuals. They went in and disappeared. Families received terse notices. "Your relative has died. Natural causes. The ashes may be claimed for a fee." Pilecki's commander proposed something insane. "We need someone to let himself be captured, be deported to Auschwitz, survive, organize internal resistance, gather intelligence, and escape to report." It was obviously a suicide mission. The odds of surviving each stage were microscopic. Getting captured without raising suspicion required flawless acting. Surviving Auschwitz for more than a few weeks required extraordinary luck. Organizing resistance under total SS surveillance required impossible audacity. Escaping required a miracle. Pilecki volunteered immediately. His reasoning was simple and terrifying in its clarity. "If we don't do this, no one will ever know. The Germans are building something in secret. When they're finished, they'll erase the evidence and the witnesses. We must document it while it's happening, or the world will never believe it happened." It was logic that would be tragically vindicated 3 years later, when the Allies rejected his report as implausible. The voluntary capture. September 19th, 1940, Warsaw. Nazi roundups followed predictable patterns. The Gestapo and Wehrmacht surrounded apartment blocks during curfew, trapped all men of military age, checked them against wanted lists, arrested selectively, and deported the rest to labor camps. Pilecki planned his capture meticulously. He adopted a false identity, Tomasz Serafiński, carpenter with no obvious military affiliation, but suspicious enough to be arrested in a roundup. He memorized the full biography of this fictional persona: where he was born, where he worked, names of relatives, every detail Nazi interrogators might verify. On the night of September 19th, Pilecki went to the Żoliborz district of Warsaw. Area resistance intelligence had identified as a likely roundup target. He positioned himself in the apartment of a resistance collaborator with 2 other agents, Jan Redzai and Czesław Jaworski, who would also allow themselves to be captured to accompany Pilecki. At 2 a.m., German troops surrounded the block. They pounded on doors with rifles, shouting in German, "Alle Männer raus, all men out." Pilecki and his 2 companions walked out calmly. 2,000 men were arrested that night, lined up in columns on the streets, guarded by Wehrmacht soldiers with machine guns. The Nazis checked documents. The officer in charge looked at Tomasz Serafiński's identification with suspicion. Occupation: carpenter, Pilecki answered in Polish. "Where do you work?" "I build furniture. I'm independent." The officer marked him as suspicious, probably because he was vague about a specific employer, exactly what Pilecki had planned. After hours of waiting in the streets while the Nazis processed papers, about 1,800 men were released. 200 were kept, including Pilecki, Redzai, and Jaworski. They were transported in military trucks to Pawiak prison in central Warsaw. Pawiak was the antechamber to hell. Cells designed for 4 held 40. There were no functional toilets. Food was a slice of bread and watery soup. Interrogations were brutal, designed to identify resistance members. For 3 days, Pilecki maintained his cover story under interrogation. The Nazis beat him, threatened him, but he consistently answered like an ignorant carpenter arrested by bad luck. It was perfect acting sustained under torture. On September 22, 1940, 3 days after the arrest, the Nazis announced the detainees' destination: deportation to concentrations lager Auschwitz. The prisoners were loaded into train cars, 100 men per car designed for 8 horses. No food, no water, no toilets. The journey to Auschwitz took 14 hours. The men were packed so tightly it was impossible to sit. Some collapsed and were trampled. Others defecated where they stood. The stench was nauseating, the heat suffocating, the fear palpable. At 10 p.m. on September 22nd, the train arrived at the Auschwitz station. The doors were thrown open. SS guards with dogs screamed, "Raus! Raus! Schneller!" Out, out, faster, beating prisoners with rifles as they forced them into lines. Pilecki had voluntarily entered the place where 1 million people would die. He was prisoner number 4,859. What the Nazis would never know was that this quiet carpenter was mentally recording every detail. Guard names, camp layout, surveillance routines, weak points in security. From his first moment in Auschwitz, Pilecki was operating as an intelligence officer infiltrated deep behind enemy lines. The mission had begun. The first days. Welcome to hell. The welcome to Auschwitz was a calculated exercise in psychological destruction. The Nazis knew that breaking human will in the first hours determined survival. Creating absolute shock, terror, and despair at first contact established the hierarchy. Prisoners were not human. They were objects that existed only for labor and death. The 728 prisoners from Pilecki's transport were lined up in the main yard. It was midnight, the temperature near freezing, and most wore light clothing because they had been arrested without warning. SS guards, assisted by kapos, privileged prisoners who supervised others, began the welcome. Mützen ab, hats off. The prisoners removed their caps. Mützen auf, hats on. The prisoners put them back on. This absurd ritual continued for 2 hours. Hats off, hats on. Faster, faster. Those who moved too slowly were beaten with clubs. Those who moved too quickly were accused of insolence and beaten harder. Pilecki, with military experience, understood immediately. It wasn't about hats. It was about destroying autonomy, teaching that orders would be arbitrary, contradictory, impossible to follow correctly. Teaching that punishment was inevitable no matter how obedient you were. After the hats, prisoners were forced to do squats, push-ups, run in circles while guards screamed conflicting orders and beat those who failed. Men collapsed from exhaustion. Kapos kicked them until they stood up or died. By 3 a.m., several prisoners were dead, their bodies left in the yard as a warning. The survivors were taken to disinfection baths. They were forced to strip completely, stand in ice-cold water while their hair, eyebrows, and body hair were shaved off. Then they were sprayed with chemical disinfectant that burned the skin, especially genitals and open wounds. Men screamed in pain. The screams were answered with blows. After disinfection, each prisoner was tattooed with an identification number on the left forearm. Pilecki officially became prisoner 4,859. No name, no identity, only a number. They were given striped uniforms, thin trousers and jacket utterly inadequate for the Polish autumn-winter. Wooden shoes that caused immediate blisters, no underwear, no socks. At 6 a.m., after 6 hours of welcome torture, prisoners were assigned to barracks. Pilecki was placed in Block 17. Barracks designed for 250 held 700. Triple-tier bunks, bare wooden planks without mattresses, one thin blanket shared by 3 prisoners. There was no sleep. At 6:30 a.m., the wake-up whistle blew. The prisoners had 5 minutes to line up outside for appel, the morning roll call. Appel was another form of torture. Prisoners stood motionless in rows while SS guards counted and sang, a process that took at least 2 hours, sometimes 6. In winter, men froze to death during appel, their bodies remaining upright in formation until the count ended. After appel, breakfast, 1 cup of coffee, hot colored water with no nutritional value, then work assignments. Auschwitz was a concentration camp built around slave labor. Prisoners worked 12 hours a day on construction projects, factories, quarries, and farms. The labor was designed to kill: impossible loads, inadequate tools, brutal pace. Capos and guards beat constantly, speeding up work, punishing any rest. Pilecki was assigned to a construction commando, hauling bricks for the camp's expansion. Each brick weighed 5 kilos. Prisoners ran with loads of 20 bricks, upstairs, non-stop. Those who moved too slowly were beaten. Those who collapsed were beaten harder. Those who didn't get up were left to die. On his first day of work, Pilecki saw 23 men die. Dehydration, exhaustion, beatings. One was shot by a guard who claimed escape attempt, when the prisoner had simply stumbled out of formation. Lunch was 1 liter of soup, water with a few pieces of rotten potato and occasional traces of unidentified meat. Caloric value: about 200 calories. Prisoners burned 3,000 to 4,000 calories a day in forced labor. The Seedgårdskorpi math was simple: death by starvation in 2 to 3 months, faster if labor and beatings accelerated it. Dinner at 7 p.m. was another slice of bread, sometimes with margarine, sometimes with synthetic jam, about 300 more calories. After dinner, another appel, another endless count, while exhausted prisoners stood rigid. Then, finally, the barracks. But there was no rest. The bunks were so tight that turning over was impossible. Prisoners with dysentery, almost everyone, defecated uncontrollably. The stench was unbearable. Rats infested the barracks, biting sleeping prisoners. Lice spread typhus. Pilecki's first day in Auschwitz: 18 hours awake, 6 hours of brutal work, beaten 3 times, witnessed 23 deaths, consumed around 700 calories total. It was unsustainable, and it was only the first day. Veterans of the camp, prisoners who had survived months, explained the simple calculus. Average survival was 3 months for construction laborers, 6 months for indoor workers, a year for prisoners with privileged positions like doctors, carpenters, administrators. Pilecki calculated he needed to survive at least a year to complete his mission. The odds were microscopic. That first night, lying on lice-ridden bunks surrounded by the dying, Pilecki faced the reality of his choice. He had voluntarily entered hell. Now he had to not only survive, but organize resistance, document atrocities, and eventually escape. The mission seemed impossible, but Pilecki understood something the Nazis ignored. Auschwitz was a killing camp built around slave labor, but it was also a society of thousands of prisoners. And where there is society, there is politics, alliances, possible resistance. The Nazis controlled the physical structures, but human connections, clandestine solidarity, invisible organization that could be built right under their noses. The next day, Pilecki began building his network, building the invisible organization, organizing. Resistance in Auschwitz was an order of magnitude harder than any underground operation in occupied territory. In Warsaw, the resistance operated in a city of 1 million people, with thousands of houses, basements, buildings, places to meet secretly. In Auschwitz, everything was under constant surveillance. SS guards with machine guns in towers, capos spying on prisoners, Nazi informants infiltrated. Immediate death as punishment for any suspected organization. But Pilecki understood Auschwitz had structural vulnerabilities he could exploit. First vulnerability. The Nazis needed the camp to function, which meant prisoners had jobs that brought them into contact with one another. Second vulnerability. The Nazis could not monitor every conversation among thousands of prisoners at all times. Third vulnerability. Capos and some guards could be bribed. Pilecki began recruiting methodically. His first criterion was survival. There was no point recruiting the dying. He sought prisoners who showed physical and mental resilience, who had survived weeks or months, who maintained dignity under inhuman conditions. His first recruit was Słowacki, a Polish officer Pilecki recognized from pre-war life. Słowacki worked in the kitchen, a privileged position that provided access to extra food. In October 1940, 3 weeks after arriving at Auschwitz, Pilecki approached Słowacki during barracks time. "We need to organize," Pilecki whispered. "We need to create a network to survive, share information, and eventually resist." Słowacki, initially suspicious it was a Nazi trap, studied Pilecki. "Why you? Why now?" "Because someone has to do it," Pilecki answered. "And because I have contacts outside who need to know what's happening in here." It was a partial lie. Pilecki had resistance contacts outside, but no way to communicate with them yet. Still, trust required projecting competence. Słowacki agreed. He became the second member of what Pilecki called Związek Organizacji Wojskowej, ZOW, the Union of Military Organizations. Next recruits came from jobs Pilecki identified as strategically important. Carpenters who built camp structures and could move between sections. Medical staff with access to hospitals who could hide sick prisoners. Warehouse workers handling supplies who could steal food and materials. ZOW's structure was cellular. Each member knew only his recruiter and the people he himself recruited. Cells were groups of 5, connected vertically but not horizontally. If one cell was compromised, the damage was limited to 5 people. It was classic insurgency architecture, adapted to the extreme conditions of a concentration camp. By December 1940, 3 months after arriving, Pilecki had recruited 72 members. By April 1941, the organization had 143. By December 1941, it reached 317 members distributed across every block and work detail. ZOW's activities were pragmatic, focused on survival before active sabotage. Early goals included food distribution. Members with kitchen access stole extra portions and distributed them to those near death. One extra slice of bread could mean the difference between life and death. Medical protection. Doctors in the organization admitted sick members to the prisoners' hospital, where they could recover from brutal labor. The Nazis allowed hospitals to maintain the workforce, but beds were limited. Zao ensured members got treatment. Work assignments. Some members worked in administrative offices and could influence job assignments. Moving members out of lethal commandos, quarries, punishment details, into less brutal posts, carpentry, administration, dramatically increased survival. Internal intelligence. Members reported guard routines, policy changes, new transports, selections for execution. Information allowed them to avoid danger and plan. Moral support. Simply knowing they were not alone, that there was organization, resistance, gave prisoners a psychological reason to survive. But Pilecki's ambition went beyond survival. Documentation. He needed to record, in obsessive detail, what was happening in Auschwitz for his eventual report to the outside. In 1941, Auschwitz was still primarily a concentration camp for Polish political prisoners, but it was evolving. The Nazis began using Zyklon B gas in September 1941, initially testing it on Soviet POWs. By 1942, massive transports of Jews from across occupied Europe began arriving. Pilecki documented everything: names of SS commanders, organizational structures, prisoner numbers, mortality rates, execution methods, the construction of gas chambers and crematoria. He could not write physically, so he memorized. He developed mnemonic systems to retain thousands of data points, names tied to images, numbers transformed into patterns, dates linked to events. It was extraordinary memory training under starvation and exhaustion. But memorizing was not enough. Pilecki had to communicate with the outside. The Nazis designed Auschwitz as a closed system. No mail, no visitors, no external communication. Prisoners entered and disappeared. Pilecki found the crack: Polish civilian workers. The communication line Auschwitz employed about 1,000 Polish civilian workers for construction, maintenance, and administration. These civilians lived outside the camp, entered daily to work, interacted in limited ways with prisoners, and then left. They were controlled by Nazi guards, but not as rigorously as prisoners. Pilecki identified that some civilian workers sympathized with the resistance. The challenge was contacting them without drawing suspicion, persuading them to risk their lives as couriers, and building a messaging system that could survive Nazi detection. His opportunity came in March 1941. Pilecki was temporarily assigned to a carpentry commando repairing camp structures. The supervisor was a Polish civilian named Władysław Surmaki, who showed subtle signs of sympathy. Sometimes he carelessly left pieces of bread where prisoners could grab them, warned about surprise SS inspections, occasionally spoke to prisoners when guards weren't watching. While repairing a shed, Pilecki approached Surmaki as guards were distracted. "I'm a Polish army officer," he whispered quickly in Polish. "I have critical information that must reach Warsaw. Can you help?" Surmaki, startled but showing no visible reaction, kept working. After a silent minute, "Too dangerous. They'll execute me." "Thousands are dying here every month," Pilecki replied. "The world needs to know. You're the only connection." Surmaki didn't answer that day, but a week later, during another shift, he came close to Pilecki. "I can carry small messages. Nothing written, only memorized information. If they catch me, I'll say you threatened me." It was an imperfect but workable arrangement. Pilecki gave him his first message for the Warsaw Resistance, a report on conditions in Auschwitz, prisoner numbers, mortality rates, and requests for supplies, food, medicines, money to bribe guards. Surmaki delivered it. 2 weeks later, he returned with a response. Your message arrived. What do you need? Pilecki had established the first communication line between Auschwitz and the outside world. It was slow, limited, vulnerable. But it worked. During 1941, Pilecki built a network of 5 civilian couriers, each passing messages to different resistance contacts in Krakow and Warsaw. Messages traveled in multiple formats: memorized information, notes written on cigarette paper hidden in clothing, codes using work receipts. Communication allowed Pilecki to do something revolutionary: request and receive supplies from outside. The resistance sent money hidden with civilian workers. Pilecki used it to bribe capos and low-level guards, buying advantages for his organization: extra food, job transfers, protection against execution selections. It wasn't much money, hundreds of zloty, the equivalent of tens of dollars. But in the camp economy, where prisoners had nothing, small amounts could buy survival. Bribes also bought something more valuable: information. Drunk guards talked. Ambitious capos revealed SS plans. Pilecki gathered intelligence on Auschwitz's transformation from concentration camp into extermination center. In July 1942 came the moment that changed everything. The first massive transports of Jews began arriving under Action Reinhard, the Nazi operation to exterminate the Jewish population of occupied Poland. Witness to industrial genocide. On July 14, 1942, a train carrying 1,000 prisoners arrived at Auschwitz from France. They were not political prisoners. They were entire Jewish families: men, women, children, the elderly. The Nazis had rounded them up in Paris under the pretense of resettlement in the East. Pilecki watched from a distance as the transport was unloaded. Unlike earlier transports of political prisoners, there was no full registration. Instead, the Nazis performed selection on the ramp. SS doctors separated prisoners into 2 groups: young, healthy men to one side, everyone else, women, children, elderly, sick, to the other. The larger group, about 750 people, was taken directly to a building labeled baths. They did not return. Hours later, trucks hauled clothing to the camp warehouses. No people. Pilecki, who had already heard rumors of gas chambers, immediately understood what he had witnessed. The Nazis had industrialized murder. These were not individual executions. It was the mass extermination of entire categories of people. In the following days came more transports. Thousands of Jews from France, the Netherlands, Belgium, Greece. Each transport, selection on the ramp, the majority sent straight to baths, disappearance. By August 1942, Auschwitz had fully evolved into an industrial machine of death. The Nazis built 4 complexes of gas chambers and crematoria in Birkenau, Auschwitz II, designed by architects with the capacity to kill 4,400 people a day. The process was chilling in its efficiency. Prisoners were led into buildings that resembled bathing facilities. They were told to disinfect after the journey. They had to undress completely, hang their clothes on numbered hooks to retrieve them afterward. Then they entered showers that were actually gas chambers. SS guards dropped Zyklon B crystals through openings in the roof. The gas, originally designed as a pesticide, killed by asphyxiation in 15 to 20 minutes. Victims, realizing the deception too late, surged toward the sealed doors, crushing one another in final panic. After confirming all were dead, Sonderkommandos, prisoners forced to work in the crematoria, opened the chambers, removed bodies, extracted gold teeth, cut hair for industrial use, and burned corpses in crematoria running 24 hours. The ashes were dumped into nearby rivers or used as fertilizer. Pilecki documented every aspect, with meticulous care. He spoke with Sonderkommandos, who described details that would break any human being. Mothers shielding children until the last moment. The elderly praying, people writing final notes that would never be read. He spoke with SS guards who got drunk and boasted of the system's efficiency. He spoke with administrators who handled transport logistics. He memorized statistics. In August 1942, about 8,000 people were gassed daily. In September, the number rose to 12,000. By the end of 1942, about 175,000 people had been murdered in Auschwitz's gas chambers. This information was almost impossible to believe. The human mind rejects numbers of atrocity on that scale. But Pilecki recorded it with obsessive precision because he knew the world would dismiss it as propaganda unless backed by verifiable details. Through his communication network, Pilecki sent increasingly urgent reports. In October 1942, he sent a detailed message describing gas chambers, crematoria, selections, and death tolls. The response from the Warsaw Resistance was skeptical. "Are you sure about these numbers? They seem exaggerated." Pilecki replied with controlled fury, "I am watching it happen. Thousands die daily. Either you believe this and do something, or millions will die." But even inside his own organization in the camp, some members did not fully believe. Industrial genocide was so unprecedented that even witnesses doubted their own perception. One ZOW member, a Polish prisoner who had survived 2 years, told Pilecki, "The Germans are civilized. Yes, this is a brutal war. But systematic industrial extermination of all Europe's Jews? It's too absurd. There must be exaggeration." Pilecki led him to an observation point where they could see the constant smoke from the crematoria. "Do you see that smoke? Those are bodies, thousands a day. Either you believe your eyes or you believe your concept of civilization. But you can't believe both." Documenting the Holocaust as it happened became Pilecki's obsession. He understood survival was not enough. He had to escape, report, and convince the world to act before extermination was complete. But there was a complication. The more information he gathered, the more valuable it was for the resistance that he remain inside the camp, sending continuous reports. His commanders in Warsaw, receiving his messages, instructed, "Continue your mission. Intelligence is critical." Pilecki faced an impossible dilemma. Staying in Auschwitz meant continued documentation, but also ever-increasing risk of death. He had already survived 2 years beyond the average expectancy. Every day was borrowed. Escaping meant saving his life and delivering a complete report, but also abandoning his network and ending the flow of intelligence. By early 1943, Pilecki calculated he had gathered enough information for a comprehensive report, and that his body might not last much longer. He had lost 30 kilos, suffered recurring typhus, been beaten dozens of times. His body was failing. In March 1943, he decided to escape in April, regardless of Warsaw's orders. But escaping Auschwitz was considered impossible. Planning the impossible Auschwitz was designed as a perfect prison. The outer perimeter consisted of electrified barbed wire at 8,000 volts, guard towers every 150 meters with machine gunners and searchlights, dog patrols, and a 2-kilometer exclusion zone around the camp where any civilian could be shot on sight. The Nazis insisted escape from Auschwitz was impossible. To reinforce this, they implemented collective responsibility. If one prisoner escaped, 10 prisoners from his block would be executed. This policy forced prisoners to police one another, reporting escape plans to avoid being selected for death. Between 1940 and 1945, of about 1.3 million people sent to Auschwitz, only 802 attempted escape. Of those, 144 succeeded. The other 658 were recaptured and publicly executed, often tortured first as a warning. The odds were 18% success, 82% a tortured death. Pilecki studied every escape attempt he had observed in 2.5 years, analyzing what worked and what failed. He identified common traits among successful escapes. Precise timing. Successful escapes happened during events that distracted guards. Allied bombings, SS inspections, mass arrivals of new transports. External help. Successful escapes almost always involved assistance from civilian workers who provided civilian clothing, documents, transportation out of the exclusion zone. Convincing disguise. Fugitives dressed as civilians or with guard-like appearance had higher chances than those hiding in wagons or tunnels. Speed. The Nazis triggered escape alarms immediately. The first 2 hours were critical. If fugitives didn't reach territory beyond the exclusion zone in that time, recapture probability increased exponentially. Pilecki developed a plan integrating all these elements. His escape team would include 2 other prisoners, Jan Redzai, captured with him in 1940, and Edward Ciesielski. Working together maximized odds. The plan required weeks of meticulous preparation. First, Pilecki needed a work assignment giving access near the perimeter. He used his network to transfer into the Bakery Commando, which operated outside the inner perimeter, but still within the security zone. Second, he needed civilian clothes. Through contacts with civilian workers, he obtained 3 sets hidden in the bakery. Trousers, shirts, jackets to blend with Polish civilians once outside. Third, he needed documents. Forgers in his network created 3 sets of identity papers using materials stolen from administrative offices. Kennkarte, German identity for Poles, Arbeitskarte, work permit, travel documents. Fourth, he needed external contact. Pilecki arranged a rendezvous with a resistance agent in Alwernia, a town 30 kilometers from Auschwitz. If they reached it, transport to Krakow would be waiting. Fifth, he needed a distraction. Escapes were often attempted during the night appel because guards were busy counting. But Pilecki needed more. Through communication with the outside, he coordinated his attempt to coincide with a simulated Allied bombing, an intentionally triggered alarm to distract guards. The escape was set for the night of April 26th to 27th, 1943. But a moral complication tormented Pilecki. Collective responsibility. His escape would mean 10 fellow prisoners from his block executed at random. Pilecki justified it with brutal calculation. 10 will die, so the information I carry can save thousands. It's terrible math, but it's the only math we have. Not everyone agreed. Some argued escape was betrayal of comrades. Pilecki replied, "By staying, I condemn more people. Outside, I can speak, report, convince the Allies to bomb the camp or the rail lines. Everyday transports continue. Thousands die. My 10 versus their thousands." It was valid logic and no less painful. On the night of April 26, 1943, Pilecki, Redzai, and Ciesielski prepared. They had memorized each step, timed each movement, planned contingencies for dozens of failure scenarios. What they didn't know was that a drunk SS guard decided to make an unplanned round that night, changing the conditions completely. The night of the escape. The April 26, 1943, 11 p.m. Pilecki, Redzai, and Ciesielski were in the bakery, on the night shift baking bread for 15,000 prisoners. The supervisor was a sympathetic Polish civilian who knew the escape plan and had agreed to carelessly leave the back door unlatched. At 11:30 p.m., the simulated bombing alarm was supposed to sound. The outside resistance had bribed a worker in the alarm system. That would create 15 to 20 minutes of confusion as guards moved into bunkers. Enough time for the three men to change into civilian clothes, slip out the back door, cross the security zone, and reach open ground before anyone noticed. At 11:28 p.m., 2 minutes before the planned alarm, Oberscharführer Hans Schmidt, an SS guard known for brutality, staggered in, clearly drunk, looking for bread to take. The civilian supervisor, nervous, gave him 2 loaves. Schmidt stayed, rambling about his childhood in Bavaria. Minutes passed, 11:30, 11:35, 11:40. The alarm finally sounded at 11:43, 13 minutes late. Hearing it, Schmidt instinctively ran out toward his post. The supervisor looked at Pilecki. Now, quickly. The 3 men stripped off their uniforms and put on civilian clothes in record time, under 2 minutes. They tucked forged documents into pockets and slipped out the back door. Outside, organized chaos. Guards ran to bunkers, searchlights swept the perimeter, dogs barked. The bombing alarm meant protocol. All guards to defensive positions, all prisoners to barracks, all civilians to shelters. But it also meant that for a brief window, areas normally watched were unattended while personnel repositioned. Pilecki led them toward the perimeter. They didn't head straight for electrified wire. That was suicide. Instead, they went to a spot Pilecki had identified where a small storage shed was built against the fence, creating a blind spot from the watchtower. They climbed onto the shed roof. From there, using a plank stolen from the bakery, they made a bridge over the electrified wire. It was insanely dangerous. The plank could slip, they could be electrocuted, they could be seen. Redzai crossed first, successful. Ciesielski second, successful. Pilecki last. Halfway over the wire, a searchlight swung toward them. Pilecki froze, fully exposed. If the operator looked directly, it was over. The light continued its pattern and passed. The operator hadn't seen them. 3 seconds later, Pilecki was on the far side, outside the primary security perimeter, but still inside a 2-kilometer exclusion zone. Every second mattered. They ran toward the forest to the north. Behind them, they heard German orders, whistles, dogs. Someone had noticed their absence faster than expected. The escape alarm sounded at 11:52 p.m., only 9 minutes after they slipped out. The Nazis activated escape protocol. All guard units mobilized, dog patrols unleashed, alerts sent to police in surrounding towns. Pilecki and his team ran. They couldn't use roads. Patrols would sweep them. They ran through dense forest, tripping over roots, smashing into brush in the dark, but moving. After 40 minutes, they estimated 5 kilometers covered. Outside the immediate exclusion zone, but not safe yet. They stopped briefly to orient themselves. Pilecki had a small smuggled compass. They needed to go northeast toward Alwernia. The forest was dense, with no clear paths. Navigation was hard. At 2 a.m., 3 hours after escape, they heard dogs nearby. Nazi patrol was closing in. Redzai, who had been a runner before the war, proposed a tactic: split up. They have dogs. Dogs follow scent trails. If we separate, we confuse the trails. We meet in Alwernia. It was risky. Separation meant if one was captured, he couldn't reveal the other's location. But it also meant each man was more vulnerable. Pilecki agreed. They split, each taking a slightly different direction toward the rendezvous. Pilecki ran alone. The dog sounded closer. He reached a small stream and had an idea. He ran down the riverbed for 30 meters, leaving scent in the water, then climbed out on the opposite bank and continued. Behind him, he heard dogs reach the point where he entered the stream. Then confusion, barking without direction, guards shouting. The tactic worked, temporarily. By 4 a.m., Pilecki estimated 15 kilometers covered. He was exhausted, dehydrated, feet bleeding in inadequate shoes. But he kept moving. At dawn, 5:30 a.m., he saw lights from a village in the distance. Alwernia. He had made it. He approached cautiously, waiting in the woods until he saw locals beginning morning activity. At 7 a.m., he entered the village acting like an ordinary Polish farm laborer. His forged papers said he was a worker from a nearby farm. The rendezvous point was the church in the center. He entered, pretending to pray. An elderly man sat in the back pew, the resistance contact. "Are you lost, son?" the man asked in the agreed code. "Looking for the way home?" Pilecki replied with a countersign. The contact led him to a safe house. Redzai was already there. They waited until noon. Ciesielski never came. After the war, they learned Ciesielski had been recaptured a kilometer from Alwernia and executed on the spot. But Pilecki and Redzai had done the impossible. Escaped Auschwitz. Now came the hardest part: making the world believe what they had seen. The report no one wanted to believe. May 1943. Pilecki reached Warsaw after a 2-week journey through occupied Poland, moving between resistance safe houses, evading checkpoints. He was starving, sick, traumatized by 2.5 years in Auschwitz, but mentally locked onto his mission: write a complete report on the extermination camp. Over the next 6 weeks, Pilecki wrote obsessively. The result was the Rapport Witold's report, a 100-page document that became the first full eyewitness report on Auschwitz available to the Allies. The report was extraordinarily detailed. Pilecki described the complete organizational structure of Auschwitz: names of SS commanders, hierarchy, guard numbers, operational procedures, prisoner conditions, caloric intake, 700 calories per day, mortality rates, 8,000 deaths per month in 1942, causes of death, starvation, typhus, executions, medical experiments, extermination operations, precise descriptions of gas chambers, crematoria capacity, 4,400 bodies daily, ramp selection process, Zyklon B use, and the Itabarbodes, fate of victims' belongings. Statistical estimates. By May 1943, he estimated about 400,000 people had been murdered in Auschwitz, mostly Jews. Recommendations. Pilecki urged bombing of gas chambers and crematoria, bombing rail lines to Auschwitz, and airdropping weapons so prisoners could organize an internal uprising. The report was sent through resistance channels to the Polish government in exile in London. In August 1943, copies were delivered to British and American intelligence. The response was devastating, near total skepticism. British intelligence analysts considered it exaggerated propaganda. In an internal note, a British officer wrote, "Descriptions of death factories are implausible. No civilized nation, even Nazi Germany, would implement such an industrial system of murder. Mr. Pilecki likely experienced a brutal concentration camp and is exaggerating due to trauma or for propaganda purposes." The Americans were similarly dismissive. A U.S. intelligence report from September 1943 stated, "While Auschwitz is clearly a concentration camp with high mortality, claims of systematic extermination of hundreds of thousands using industrial gas chambers are not credible. German concentration camps are brutal, but not mass extermination factories. There were several reasons for this skepticism. Lack of precedent. The Holocaust was unprecedented. Systematic industrial genocide had never been attempted in human history. Analysts simply had no conceptual framework to believe it was possible. Bias against Polish sources. British and Americans often viewed Polish sources as inherently unreliable, prone to exaggeration and propaganda. Poland had been invaded, had a desperate government in exile, and the Allies assumed atrocity reports were inflated to gain support. World War I propaganda experience. During World War I, both sides fabricated atrocity propaganda. The British spread false stories about Germans bayoneting Belgian babies. After the war, these were exposed as inventions. Analysts in 1943 assumed Auschwitz reports were similar propaganda. Psychological denial. Humans struggle to process atrocities beyond normal experience. Accepting Pilecki's report required confronting the possibility of absolute evil operating industrially. It was cognitively easier to dismiss it as exaggeration. But the most important reason was likely strategic inaction. Even if the Allies had fully believed Pilecki, bombing Auschwitz or its rail lines would have required diverting resources from other military priorities. It was more convenient to doubt the report than to face a morally complex decision about how to respond. Pilecki, who had risked everything, survived hell, escaped, was shattered. He wrote a desperate letter to British contacts in November 1943. I have provided detailed evidence. I have offered my services as a guide if the RAF decides to bomb the camp. What more do you need? How many must die before action is taken? There was no reply. Pilecki kept pressing. He wrote additional reports in 1944, updating numbers. By mid-1944, he estimated 1.5 million had been murdered in Auschwitz. He urged immediate action while the Hungarian deportations were underway. 437,000 Hungarian Jews were deported to Auschwitz between May and July 1944. Nothing changed. The Allies never bombed Auschwitz, never bombed the rail lines, never dropped weapons for a prisoner uprising. The camp operated until January 1945, when the Soviet Red Army liberated it. By then, about 1.1 million people had been murdered there. Pilecki, who had documented genocide as it happened, escaped to warn the world, provided detailed evidence, was ignored. His mission, in terms of preventing additional deaths at Auschwitz, failed. Not because he failed, because the world refused to believe the unbelievable. After the war, the final punishment, Pilecki survived the rest of the war as a fighter in the Warsaw Uprising of August to October 1944. When the Polish resistance tried to liberate Warsaw before the Soviets arrived. The uprising was crushed brutally by the Wehrmacht. Pilecki was captured and sent to a German POW camp, where he remained until Allied liberation in 1945. When the war ended, Poland was not liberated, but exchanged one occupation for another, Nazi occupation for Soviet occupation. Stalin installed a puppet communist government, suppressed anti-communist resistance, and began arresting veterans of non-communist resistance as enemies of the state. Pilecki, who had survived Auschwitz and the war, made a fatal decision: to remain in Poland and report on Soviet oppression. He joined the anti-communist resistance, operating as an intelligence agent documenting crimes of the communist regime. In 1947, he was arrested by the communist secret police, accused of spying for Western imperialist powers because of his wartime contacts with the government in exile. After months of torture, Pilecki, never broke. He was put on trial in a show proceeding in March 1948 and sentenced to death. On May 25, 1948, Witold Pilecki, who had voluntarily entered Auschwitz, organized underground resistance, escaped and documented the Holocaust, was executed with a shot to the back of the head in Mokotów prison in Warsaw. He was 47. His last words, according to witnesses, "I have tried to live in such a way that in my final hour I would feel joy rather than fear." His body was dumped in an unmarked grave. His family did not learn where he was buried until 2012. For 41 years under Poland's communist regime, Pilecki was erased from history. His Auschwitz reports were suppressed because they proved communists were not the only resistance heroes. His anti-communist activities were used to smear him. Only after 1989, after the fall of communism, did his story begin to re-emerge. In 1995, he was posthumously awarded the Order of the White Eagle, Poland's highest decoration. In 2006, he was officially declared innocent of all communist charges. His report, Witolda, ignored in 1943, is now considered one of the most important Holocaust documents. The legacy of the volunteer, Witold Pilecki's story, is unique in Holocaust history because it reverses the usual narrative. We typically hear about victims who tried to escape and couldn't, or survivors who escaped and testified. Pilecki voluntarily entered the worst place humans ever created, with a premeditated plan to survive the impossible, document the inconceivable, and report the unbelievable. His heroism was different from battlefield heroism. He did not kill Nazis. He did not sabotage factories. He did not liberate prisoners. What he did was worse in Nazi eyes, and more valuable to history. He documented. In a regime built on secrecy, documentation was the most dangerous form of resistance. The Nazis could tolerate occasional sabotage. They could not tolerate witnesses. Pilecki was the ultimate witness. For 947 days, he observed, memorized, organized, survived. Then he escaped and wrote testimony that became foundational to understanding the Holocaust. But his legacy is also a warning about denial. The world had detailed evidence of Auschwitz in August 1943. Pilecki provided names, numbers, processes, structures, and the world chose not to believe. Not because the evidence was insufficient, because believing required action, and action required strategic sacrifice that Allied leaders were unwilling to make. That denial remains a permanent shadow over the Allied victory. While we celebrate the defeat of Nazism, we must remember that defeat came only after the Allies allowed the extermination machinery to operate uninterrupted for years, killing millions, despite having detailed evidence of what was happening. Pilecki died knowing his mission was both success and failure. Success in documenting, failure in convincing. Success in surviving, failure in stopping. His final irony, he survived Auschwitz, only to be murdered by the government of the nation that was supposed to have been liberated. The Nazis never discovered that prisoner number 4859 was an intelligence agent operating under their noses. But even if they had discovered it, they would have failed to stop him. Because by the time he escaped, Pilecki had already accomplished his main goal, to document the truth for history. That truth, initially rejected, eventually prevailed. Pilecki's reports were used in the Nuremberg trials. They were cited by Holocaust historians. They were taught to generations. The man who voluntarily entered hell to tell the story was finally heard. It just took 40 years after his death. At the Auschwitz Museum today, there is an exhibition dedicated to Pilecki. Visitors can read excerpts from his rapport Witolda, see his photograph before he was sent to the camp, and learn about the clandestine organization he built. Most visitors are left in shock. The idea that someone infiltrated Auschwitz voluntarily is hard to process. But it was exactly that shock Pilecki counted on. The Nazis would never suspect anyone would enter hell voluntarily. And in that, Pilecki was absolutely right. He was a prisoner for 947 days. The Nazis never suspected. They never uncovered his organization of nearly 1,000 members. They never detected his communication network with the outside. They never knew he was running a military intelligence mission while hauling bricks and baking bread. When he escaped, the Nazis assumed he was just another prisoner fleeing brutal conditions. They never understood they had lost their most dangerous witness. Witold Pilecki proved something profound about resistance. The most powerful weapons against tyranny are not always physical. Sometimes they are testimonial. Sometimes they are documentary. Sometimes they are simply refusing to let the truth be erased. The Nazis built Auschwitz to be a perfectly guarded secret. Pilecki turned it into a perfectly documented crime. In the end, his volunteering was a victory, even though he did not live to see it.